All right, folks, welcome back to another lecture. Hope you're having a good time and enjoying these lectures. I'm sort of enjoying doing them. I don't know, it reminds me of the good old days. And, if you need any, did I say yo? Excuse me. If you need any other help, if you need anything, like reach out. I know the midterms coming up, so you want to pay attention to that. But today's lecture is going to be about civil war, intrastate war, and and terrorism. These two fit really well together. That's why we're talking about them together. And I happen to really enjoy, when I was an undergraduate, I happened to really enjoy learning about the different civil wars in the world, the different factions, and the different proxy sponsorships. So, like the Soviet Union, the U.S., and how basically supply chains are developed and weapons are funneled in. All that stuff is fascinating to me, even though it's quite depressing. But nevertheless, we are going to talk about interstate conflict today. And you might notice that in the world, since the Cold War and since the 90s, especially since the 90s, we've had a decline in state-to-state conflict. And we see this rise of civil wars. So if you look at the any definition of a civil war or an armed conflict within a country, usually it's typically defined as a situation where there's been more than 1,000 battle deaths. So that would be a civil war. You can argue that Iraq is in a civil war, and Afghanistan, Sri Lanka in 2005, and Chad, and all of these were in some sort of civil war. In Africa, we've seen several civil wars in Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia, and these kind of civil wars sort of proliferate across borders with states that are already insecure, states that are already weakened. And this could be because of several reasons. It could be due to corruption, or a collapse of an economy, or a collapse of the state apparatus, the security apparatus. Or if a figure dies, like Tito of Yugoslavia, that can create a civil war within the territory called Yugoslavia. So we see that between 1946 and 1988, there were 30 interstate conflicts, but between the same period, there were 65. So we're seeing that there's more intra-state conflicts than inter and or civil wars. There were more civil wars than state to state. Between 1989 and 2007, there were only 9 interstate conflicts and 54 intrastate conflicts. So yes, there is some sort of rise of the intrastate conflict of civil wars, and so we have to pay attention to that. There's several reasons for this. The first one could be that a colonial power is pulling out. No more, we're done with this area, we're pulling out. And as they pull out, they leave a power vacuum that allows different factions, whether they're ethnic or linguistic or class, to actually fight to actually win the state apparatus. So that could be one of the reasons. Another reason could be the end of the Cold War. So at the end of the Cold War, we had this conclusion of the Soviet Union, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And as they withdraw, then you may have like the funding to Africa or the funding to Latin America from the Soviet Union suddenly disappear. And this could cause other groups to rise up and attack and try to take over. This could also explain why proxy wars suddenly dried up, because now there was no Soviet Union. There was no bipolar world order. There was only one country in charge, the United States, and that might have helped end interstate conflicts. Also, we've had the growth of global norms that prescribe the use of military force. This is called the Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. This is a UN doctrine that says that if a state has failed to guarantee peace and security for a state, for the people within a state, then it's the responsibility of other actors like the United Nations, members of the United Nations, to get involved in that conflict. So that could help create some stability in the world systems. So intrastate wars, these involve combat, sustained combat, involving armed forces that are capable to actually sustain a conflict, and usually it can lead to about over a minimum of 1,000 battle deaths in a year. So that would be a definition of an intrastate conflict. And so when we look at that, we're talking, when we look at intra-state conflicts, we're talking about like civil wars, control over a capital city, or it could be over a local issue. But there is some problem, there's some dislocation that one group is not getting along with another group. One of the reasons for this, it could be just a struggle against capitalism. So capitalism is, just the way you set up an economy. That's all it is. It's a free market. Let's be simple. It is a free market economy, which creates inequality naturally. There's always going to be an inequality. Some of us work harder than others. Some of us are smarter than others. Some of us run faster and are like bigger. And so, there's always going to be, inequality in everything. And so socialism is trying to correct that situation and create a more equal society. And so you could have a situation like in Nicaragua when there's a civil war over, because of socialism, or in Nepal when the Maoists have basically won government after a long civil war over the monarchy. So there's one reason why there could be just a revolutionary shift in the way people perceive economic systems. There also can be a pushback against dictatorships. Like in Libya, the Libyan civil war in 2011 onward until whenever it was finished, 2013, 2014, this was a war fought against a dictator. So dictatorships are basically your authoritarian government. There's no democracy, and there's a group of people who want democracy, and they're going to fight for it. So we see this in Libya. We saw this in Syria. We see this in other countries, in Latin America and in Africa, where people are just trying to fight for their freedom. And sometimes, even though they say they're fighting for freedom, they're actually fighting to be dictators themselves. And that's, of course, a problem, because we're going to have this ongoing cycle of conflict. But there could also be secular versus religious wars. So there could be a country like Iran or Afghanistan who are secular. Like Afghanistan before the Taliban was a secular country. It was a kingdom that suffered from a Marxist coup, and then that Marxist person got overthrown by another guy, Marxist, and the Soviet Union came in, and there was a civil war with the Soviets, and it was a very long fight. So that could be one of the reasons of a civil war. There's also the identity and secessionist conflict. So maybe one group has power over another group. So Lebanon is a great example, where the Mennonite Christians had most of the power and most of the wealth and most of the control. And the Muslim minority at the time was this is 1958, where the Muslim minority rejected it outright. And so that could be a civil war where a lot of a majority of people don't have access or aren't represented properly in government. It could also be an autonomy situation where people, like in Sudan, in the southern part, what is now southern Sudan, want more freedom to rule themselves. We see this in Sri Lanka again with the Tamil Tigers back in the early 2000s, late 2000s, and during the war in between what was India and Pakistan. Together, the British mandate of India, where you had Pakistan wanting more autonomy, and then, of course, eventually you would have Pakistan and East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. In 1971, there was a war. Bangladesh wanted to become independent, and of course, in this war in the United States, the American War of Independence was basically this secessionist movement, not so much a revolution in the pure sense. It was a war of secession, right? They didn't want to pay taxes, so they said, "Hey, we can." And I totally agree. I don't want to pay taxes either, and if I can't get representation in government, then the country doesn't work for me. That's a good topic right there. Fun fact: there is a channel called Weird History, and they have a video on the history of gout. Now, gout is a rich man's disease. So gout is what you want to get. It's this pain in your foot because you eat the richest foods, the lobsters and the shrimp and the steak every day. You know, every day you have something amazing with lots of cream. And basically gout kept the Prime Minister of Great Britain away from Parliament when the United States was basically asking for representation in Parliament. And the Prime Minister at the time, I think his name was Pitt the Younger or Pitt the Elder, I can't remember which Pitt, but because Pitt was away, he couldn't voice his support for American representation in the British Parliament. And so gout helped cause the United States to be what it is today. Great little channel. Check it out if you have some time. Of course, we all have time. So yeah, if you're interested in that stuff. There's also conflicts over resources and power. We already covered that. So yes, there's a lot of different reasons and ways in which two groups of people within a state can go to war, and so it can be based on any organizing principle. Organizing principle. This is a key term here. What this means is that it is an issue area that everybody can get behind. It could be it could be ethnicity, it could be religious, it could be class, it could be identity, it could be anything that divides. It could be anything that says, I am me and you are you. You are not me. You are other, and I am an other. So you other, people say, you other me. Like, does that make sense? I hope so. So you create an self and other. And the others, they're usually the bad guys, and you are the good guys, right? And so you will fight and kill others to protect yourself. And this is, again, it's about ethnicity, religion. It could be anything that unites, any organizing principle, right? But it could be based on fear of eradication, of corruption, that maybe the country is so corrupt that your group of people are not getting access to the wealth and maybe the healthcare that you want. Another thing that is interesting is an economy when it comes to economies. Excuse me. So sometimes the economy is illegal. So there's black market, like drug economies or precious metal, illegal trafficking, any of this sort of thing. That's organized crime. And organized crime can become political because a good case would be in Colombia. You have what's known as the FARC, FARC, and that stands for something. It's in Spanish, but it's a group of people that are socialists, but they trade drugs, they traffic in drugs, and that creates more power. And so they have a lot of autonomy in their region, which borders Venezuela. And so they and Venezuela work together against Colombia. So they have the border security there is very weak, and it allows people to basically maximize their profits as they export their sort of wealth and the guns that come in to fight a civil war. So yes, there is a civil war in Colombia, and it continues even though members of FARC they're in the Colombian government. Because at the end of the day, Colombia is a weak, fragile state. They don't have much of a choice. They can't win this war, and so they have to placate or they have to compromise with a terrorist group. So if you think that the United States or any other countries don't negotiate with terrorists, there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different examples of states negotiating with terrorists. Of course, there are occasions where states do not negotiate with terrorists, but that doesn't mean that they don't. Yes. So, how do they fight civil wars? Usually, they can fight with a regular army. They can acquire heavy weapons and artillery, but they can also do so using paramilitary and guerrilla tactics. Hit and run sort of things, terrorist attacks. And we're going to talk about terrorism in a few moments. So the methods of warfare can be various. Depends on the case that you're studying. There's occasions like in the Lebanese Civil War when each side had heavy weapons. Each side used terrorist tactics. In Africa, child soldiers are used. Sexual rape, sexual crimes are prolific. Ethnic cleansing, food deprivation, crimes against humanity that go on. And so, you might want to take a step back and ask yourself, why are all of these things happening? And again, I want to remind you that it's all about the types of conflicts that are being fought. Sometimes they're fought for greed, control over resources, or because of class conflict, again. And other times it's that one party or one group of people have more power than another group of people. And so instead of negotiating or going through democratic means or, taking your issue to, maybe they don't have the freedom of expression, and so they have to fight to gain some equality. And there is a rational choice model that goes into it. There's a rational choice. We talked about rational choice yesterday, chapter 3, or last week, if you are watching this a week later, the previous lecture, where people realize that the costs of going to war would be minimal compared to the benefit. So sometimes if you don't go to war, you risk losing your life, right? And that would be ultimately not a good thing. You want to survive. And so the costs are certainly do not outweigh the benefits because you want to live at the end of the day. So that's the simplest way that I can put it. So ethnic conflicts, identity politics, identity conflicts, these are not new. These are some things that, again, come back to this organizing principle that help unite people. So when it comes to nationalist conflicts between, let's say, France and Germany, these go back generations. Well, since the invention of nationalism during the Napoleonic era, I think that would be the best way. That's when nationalism really started. Before that, it was not about nationalism. It was about maybe empire or monarchy. It was a practice not open to the masses. War was an elitist sport. But when nationalism came around, nationalism opened up to the masses. So when it comes to fighting wars, greed might be a motivation, but it's certainly not the only motivation, because there's also survival and creating a better life for yourself and for others. There's a lot of different places that are suffering from civil wars, but they usually right now they are situated in the global south, in Africa, in the continent of Africa, in the continent of Latin America, specifically in some of the Central American republics and in Colombia. And there are guerrillas in Peru as well as in Ecuador and Bolivia. So there's a lot of some of them are Marxist, some of them are religious, some of them are like Boko Haram are religious. Yes, and in Syria we have an amalgam of different fighters, of different religions, of different national, not national, but ideological. You have the Assad, pro-Assad, and anti-Assad, or democratic. I don't know. I don't know who the people in Syria, who they are. I'm very skeptical about who the Americans are helping down there. So how do we create some peace? From my understanding, like, you gotta help create economic development. You have to help to prevent a civil war. You have to create inclusive democratic institutions so everybody feels that there's some representation. It might not be perfect. There might always be grievances, but people have to feel that they have a stake in the game to let or keep their country secure. Inequality has to be reduced. The economy has to serve everyone, and you're going to have to lower corruption. You're going to have to provide the infrastructure to allow for accountability and transparency, so people don't have to bribe. So sometimes, in the Central Asian republics, in Afghanistan, in order to get anything done, you're going to have to give them what's called a tip. I think it's called baksheesh. You just give somebody a tip so a service can be done. And it's like, imagine going to the DMV, you want a driver's license, and you have to pay the fee for the driver's license, but you also have to give the guy, reviewing your case, you got to give him a little tip. You imagine living in a world like that. It's going to punish the poorest of the people in that country, and ultimately, if they don't feel that they are a part of a country, if they don't feel pride in being a part of that country or benefit from that system, then why would they want to play along, right? So it just comes down to that. It comes down to a rational choice. There's also normative change, human security, educating people against violence against like women and children and all that. Is very important. Creating affirmative action for minority groups, so that they are included in something that people are talking about. Affirmative action is a little controversial in this country, but in other countries, it's like, yeah, we need other people, disenfranchised people, to come in and really feel part of the system. So there's less incentive to go to war, right? So that's the key. That's the key right there. That we need to focus on, to make the world a better place. Everybody's going to have to feel that they are part of the system. People who don't feel like they're part of the system, these would be terrorists. So that's a segue into terrorism. Now, terrorism, you can define it as a strategy to weaken an authority so that the terrorist group can have more leeway in the system. So, for instance, terrorists tend to target governments that they hate and that they believe are repressive and corrupt. So Muslim terrorists hate the U.S. because it supports corrupt regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so forth. So that's the logic for 9/11. It was a very stupid way to do it, of course. But basically, the Al-Qaeda wanted to destroy the United States by, doing the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in order to weaken the United States so they can withdraw support from Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia. But of course, we all know what happened. So it's violence to weaken a hated authority, but it's also to inspire fear. It's to inspire fear of others. Fear, and in creating fear in other people, that you would somehow get your way, that you would satisfy your goals. Now, terrorism is not specifically insane. It is rational in the sense that they're calculating costs and benefits. So terrorism is this, it's a tactic to show to the world that even though the terrorist group is weak, that they are indeed strong, and once they can carry out this terrorist attack, they can recruit new members. So it's to show that, hey, we can strike back against the enemy. Come join us. So there is some rationality behind it. Now, suicide bombings, you might say that is irrational, because once you do it, you lose your life. Once you carry out a suicide attack, you lose your life. And you're not wrong, but you're also not right. Because here's what happens. When you carry out this suicide attack, you might die, but your family will receive payments and support, healthcare, education. Right? They'll be taken care of because of your sacrifice. And it's not usually the leadership conducting these attacks. It's usually some low-level person, some poor person. Usually it's a very poor person that needs economic help. So that's the problem. The leadership, they're not the ones conducting the attack. You didn't see Osama bin Laden in the plane, attacking the United States on 9/11. Osama bin Laden was hiding in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan and then Pakistan. So it is rational for the leadership as well. So terrorism is a group activity, and it is political in nature. It's political in nature because there's a political goal attached to the attack. Now, that's key. Now, why is it that the Middle East is a sort of breeding ground for terrorists? It's a great question. It's because of high unemployment rates and the ideas of Islamic terrorism that can recruit people. And that's a cause for concern, because you can kill terrorists, but you can't kill an idea. Once an idea exists, it doesn't go away. It's there for good almost. So terrorism is characterized by this use of violence, and it has a long history. But specifically, it's the tactics that weak groups of people use to inspire fear in the enemy, to provoke a reaction, and to unite their population. And it rarely succeeds, because in the long run, nobody wants to be around you. Nobody wants to take you seriously. What people want to do with terrorists? They want to eradicate terrorists. They want to destroy terrorists because they target civilians. And so the state is supposed to protect civilians. And so if you attack civilians and you kill innocent civilians, no one's going to like you, no one's going to take you seriously, and people are going to seek to eradicate you completely, wipe you off the face of the earth. So bear that in mind. In the long run, terrorism fails because they never achieve their objectives. Again, terrorism fails in the long run because they never, ever achieve their objectives. Remember, war is politics by other means. War is politics by other means, meaning there has to be a political objective. Think of terrorism this way. Terrorism is also politics by other means, but that the weak use to achieve their goals, which they don't achieve. Because at the end of the day, right, you are forever going to be painted with this brush. And you might get some support, but at the end of the day, no country is going to negotiate with you, or countries are going to be very wary to negotiate with you. Some countries have to negotiate, as I said prior. So global jihad, right? This idea that the Muslim Brotherhood or any group, Al Qaeda or Islamic State, Boko Haram. They perceive themselves as oppressed, and that's because of the West. And what they want to do is to reassert traditional fundamentalist values going back to the ancient world. And it's the part of this is because of the lack of resources that they have. Going back to our discussion on civil wars, a lot of countries don't have the infrastructure in place to discourage terrorism. So the economic development and the alternatives necessary, so people don't turn to terrorism, right? So people don't join terrorist groups. And that's what happened in Iraq, right? The reason why we have ISIS is because of Iraq collapsing. So Iraq collapsed, and these weak actors that still existed used terrorism to push the U.S. out. But of course, every time that the U.S. tries to leave, there's a terrorist attack, and the U.S. has to come back in. So, negotiating with the Taliban that the Trump administration is doing hopefully works out. I don't know if we will ever leave Afghanistan and terrorism, but terrorism doesn't. They do operate cross-border activity, but terrorism is usually a problem for developing countries and Islamic countries. So it's really up to these people in these countries to help themselves eradicate terrorism. Because again, terrorism rarely succeeds because they never succeed in achieving their goals. There's always a backlash. There's always a punishment because of this. And, we talk a lot about the different goals of terrorism. And yes, terrorism has not succeeded to scare the U.S. in any way. And if anything, the United States has doubled down and destroyed Al-Qaeda cells, and will continue to do so forever, probably, because we're talking about an idea, not so much a group of people. So now we have ISIS in the Middle East, and ISIS is pretty much destroyed, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to come back. They're probably just going to rest and wait for the moment where the time is right, because they thrive in power vacuums. And so what the United States needs to do, and Iraqis need to do for themselves, and people in Afghanistan, they need to realize that the structure of their system in their country, their political system, needs to serve everyone. I think that's the goal at the end of the day, is that civil wars and terrorism and organized crime boils down to the fact that there's a lack of alternatives for people to turn to. So they're not turning to terrorism all the time. So I think that's where I want to leave it today. Terrorism, I can go into a history of terrorism of Al-Qaeda, and how it was a reaction against the secular governments of Egypt and Saudi Arabia. But these things are basically in the assigned readings for today. I think, yes. So if there's anything that anyone needs, please reach out. Happy to do it. Finish the lectures for this week. And yes, so thank you so much for your attention. Have a beautiful rest of your day.